On August 6, 2024, Ukrainian soldiers crossed the border into Russia's Kursk province. It was the first invasion of foreign troops into Russian territory since World War II. When Russia's special military operation began in February of 2022, the plan was simple. Russian tanks would roll into Kyiv while special forces seized key buildings and raised the Russian flag. The operation to conquer Ukraine and to install a puppet government would take only a few days. But Russia's leader, Vladimir Putin, miscalculated. The Ukrainian defense was formidable, and now, more than 2 years into the campaign, Ukraine's military are on the attack, fighting inside Russia's borders. The Ukrainian counterattack caught both the Russian armed forces and the president himself completely by surprise. And as Vladimir Putin scrambles to explain how intelligence warnings were ignored and border guards failed to stop thousands of troops from storming across the border, there's a sense of history repeating. The last time Russia had to fight an invading army, it was 1941. It was Soviet leader Joseph Stalin who ignored the many warnings of a coming invasion. And when Nazi Germany launched their attack, the Red Army was caught unaware and unprepared. It was an invasion that would ultimately turn the tide of World War II. In September of 1940, Germany signed an agreement called the Tripartite Pact, which brought Germany, Italy, and Japan together as the Axis powers. In the agreement, Japan recognized the leadership of Germany and Italy in the establishment of a new order in Europe. In return, Germany and Italy recognized Japan's right to establish a new order in Greater East Asia. The contents of the pact seemed to undermine another agreement the Germans had signed just a year previous, a non-aggression pact between Germany and the Soviet Union. By the time the Tripartite Agreement was signed, Germany had invaded Poland, and in response, Britain and France had declared war on Germany. Paris had already surrendered to Hitler, and a fierce bombing campaign was underway in Britain. With trust between the Soviet Union and Germany frayed, Hitler invited Stalin to send Russian Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov to Berlin. For 3 days in November, Molotov met with German Foreign Minister Ribbentrop and Hitler in an attempt to bring the Soviets into the fold of the Tripartite Pact. Molotov left Berlin empty-handed, but a few weeks later, the Soviets sent the Germans a long list of demands required for Soviet participation in the Tripartite Pact. The list was far too expensive for Hitler. The Germans never replied. Instead, on December 18, 1941, Hitler issued Directive No. 21 to the German Army's High Command. It read, "The German armed forces must be prepared to crush Soviet Russia in a quick campaign, Operation Barbarossa, even before the conclusion of the war against England." Hitler believed Operation Barbarossa would achieve its goals within 10 weeks, and that the rapid defeat of the USSR would convince Great Britain to negotiate an end to the war in the West. Barbarossa would begin in the early morning hours of June 22, 1941. When Stalin was woken with the news, he wouldn't believe it. Hours passed before he would accept his calamitous misjudgments and issue a general order to fight back by every means possible. Stalin and the Red Army had been caught by surprise. While the possibility of a German invasion was considered real, Stalin did not believe Hitler would strike while still fighting Great Britain in the West. The Red Army, for its part, was in poor condition and unprepared for war. This was, in large part, a result of Stalin's own actions. There's a quote often attributed to Vladimir Lenin, who still has a major role to play in this story, which reads, "There are decades when nothing happens, and there are weeks when decades happen. Whether or not Lenin actually said this is up for debate, but for Russia in early 1917, the quote couldn't be more relevant. At the time, Russia was a monarchy. The Romanov dynasty had ruled Russia for over 300 years, but under the leadership of Emperor Nicholas II, the country was now in turmoil. World War I had been raging for nearly 3 years, and after a string of Russian military failures and a high number of casualties, public support for the war had evaporated. In February of 1917, war fatigue and long-standing discontent with the monarchy erupted into mass protests. It was the beginning of the end for the Russian Empire. 2 years previous, in the summer of 1915, Tsar Nicholas announced that he would take personal command of the army in an attempt to boost morale and repair his reputation as a leader. The ploy failed miserably. He proved to be an incompetent military leader, and commanding troops from the front lines left him unable to govern, giving the reins of power to his wife, Alexandra, who was even more unpopular. Born in Germany, Alexandra and Nicholas married in 1894. The pair had 5 children together, including their only son, Alexei, who suffered from hemophilia, a blood clotting disorder. At first, Alexandra turned to Russian doctors to treat Alexei, but their treatments generally failed. In desperation, Alexandra turned to faith. In 1906, the mystic and faith healer Grigory Rasputin began treating Alexei, and his methods seemed to work. As the years passed, Rasputin began to have considerable influence over Alexandra, and when Nicholas left St. Petersburg to command the armies, Alexandra made sweeping changes to the government, often firing competent ministers and other officials only to replace them with Rasputin's cronies. Believing the mad monk's influence over Alexandra threatened the Russian Empire, a group of aristocrats conspired to kill him in December of 1916. Prince Felix Yusupov, one of the richest men in Russia, lured Rasputin to Moika Palace in St. Petersburg and murdered him in the basement. Yusupov and his co-conspirators believed that Rasputin's removal would give Nicholas one last chance at restoring the reputation and prestige of the monarchy. But they were wrong. Just 2 months later, the February Revolution took place, and amid mass protests and mutinies, Nicholas abdicated the throne in March of 1917, ending the Romanov dynasty's 304-year rule of Russia. The State Duma or Parliament took control, and a provisional government was formed in the days after the February Revolution. But it lasted only 8 months before another revolution in October would bring the far-left Bolshevik party led by Vladimir Lenin to power. This would be the end of the Romanov family. The provisional government had placed the family under house arrest, but after the October Revolution, they were moved to Ipatiev House, where in July of 1918, the family were executed by firing squad. It's unclear who gave the order to have the family killed, but Leon Trotsky, effectively Lenin's second in command, made it clear in his memoirs that Lenin felt it was unwise to leave the family alive. With Lenin at the helm, the Bolsheviks became the Russian Communist Party. In the chaos and uncertainty surrounding the fall of the monarchy and the transition to socialism, a number of Soviet republics formed. In 1922, Lenin's Russian Communist Party wrote up a treaty that combined these republics into a federal government, the Soviet Union. It was a one-party socialist state controlled by the Russian Communist Party, but the real controlling authority was the party's Central Committee. During this period of unrest and rapid change, one of Lenin's key operatives was Joseph Stalin. Lenin saw him as tough and loyal, capable of getting things done behind the scenes. With the formation of the Soviet Union, the Central Committee was expanded, creating the office of the General Secretary, a position filled by Joseph Stalin. Stalin soon learned how to use his new office to manipulate the structures of government and to install loyal individuals in key roles. That same year, Lenin's health began to rapidly deteriorate. He suffered a stroke in May of 1922 and retreated from public life. Stalin began to visit him frequently, acting as an intermediary between Lenin and the outside world. But as Lenin's health continued to deteriorate, so did his relationship with Stalin. With Lenin's future as party leader uncertain, a power struggle began to brew in the Communist Party. Stalin and Leon Trotsky were both considered potential successors, but when Lenin suffered a second stroke in December of 1922, he dictated Lenin's Testament, in which he discussed the personal qualities of his comrades Trotsky and Stalin. He recommended that Stalin be removed from the position of General Secretary, deeming him ill-suited for the position. Instead, he recommended Trotsky for the job, describing him as the most capable man in the present Central Committee. Lenin died on January 21, 1924. Stalin was given the honor of organizing his funeral, and he was officially hailed as Lenin's successor as the leader of the Communist Party and of the Soviet Union itself. Through his office as General Secretary, Stalin received advanced warning about Lenin's testament, and with the help of party colleagues, including Grigory Zinoviev and Lev Kamenev, the letter was suppressed and not widely published. To maintain the facade of party unity and give the public confidence in their new government, there was little objection to Stalin's rise. But behind that facade of unity, deep divisions had developed and various factions formed within the Communist Party. Stalin quickly pivoted to focus on his rival Leon Trotsky. Trotsky's downfall was swift. Stalin expelled him from the party in November 1927. Trotsky was exiled to Kazakhstan in 1928, then expelled from the Soviet Union in February of 1929. He lived the rest of his life in exile. With his main rival dispatched, Stalin continued to consolidate power. With the defeat of Leon Trotsky and his supporters, open criticism of Stalin within the Communist Party was virtually non-existent. Roughly every 5 years, Communist Party delegates would meet at a party congress to elect representatives to lead the Central Committee, which directed all party and government activities. The highest position on the committee was General Secretary, a position held by Joseph Stalin. The 17th Party Congress in early 1934 was a turning point for Stalin. One of his party colleagues, Sergei Kirov, was gaining notoriety. Kirov was secretary of the Central Committee. He was enormously popular within the party and was a charismatic and talented speaker. There's a lack of hard evidence, but it's claimed that several regional party secretaries, unhappy with the cult of personality surrounding Stalin, met privately to discuss replacing him as General Secretary. The most likely replacement was Sergei Kirov. Stalin survived the party congress as leader, but Kirov would be dead before the end of the year. Kirov was assassinated in December of 1934 under suspicious circumstances. Stalin quickly moved to blame Kirov's death on dissenters within the party, including the men who helped him take power in the first place, Grigory Zinoviev and Lev Kamenev. Their alliance began to crumble almost as soon as Stalin took power. By 1926, Zinoviev and Kamenev had formed an opposition faction within the party, and they aligned with Leon Trotsky's faction. All three were expelled from the party in 1927. Trotsky continued to oppose Stalin, which led to his subsequent exile, but Zinoviev and Kamenev were quick to reverse course. They wrote open letters apologizing and admitting their mistakes, and they were readmitted to the Communist Party. They never regained their positions on the Central Committee, but it seemed like all was forgiven until the assassination of Sergei Kirov in 1934. Stalin quickly blamed the opposition factions in the Communist Party for Kirov's death. Zinoviev, Kamenev, and their closest associates were once again expelled from the party and arrested. They were tried in 1935 and forced to admit moral complicity in Kirov's assassination. In August 1936, after months of rehearsals in secret police prisons, Zinoviev, Kamenev, and 14 others were put on trial again. This time, the charges included forming a terrorist organization responsible for killing Kirov and attempting to kill Stalin. The trial of the 16 was the first of many show trials where old Bolsheviks confessed to increasingly elaborate crimes, including espionage, poisoning, and sabotage. Zinoviev and the other defendants were found guilty. Before the trial, Zinoviev and Kamenev had agreed to plead guilty to the false charges on the condition that they not be executed, a condition that Stalin accepted, stating, "That goes without saying." But a few hours after their conviction, Stalin ordered their execution. Shortly after midnight on the morning of August 25, 1936, Zinoviev and Kamenev were executed by firing squad. They most certainly had nothing to do with the death of Sergei Kirov, and there's no clear evidence to link Stalin to the assassination, but as author and historian Boris Nikolaevsk observed, one thing is certain: the only man who profited from the Kirov assassination was Stalin. On the day of Kirov's murder, Stalin signed 2 new laws authorizing the NKVD, the Soviet secret police, to arrest people suspected of planning terrorist acts, sentence them without legal process, and execute them within 24 hours. The trial of the 16 was just the first step in a purge that would sweep across the Soviet Union, targeting anyone who was seen as a threat to Stalin's regime. Nobody was immune from sudden prosecution. While initially targeting political opponents, soon artists and writers, and even military institutions were targeted. Although estimates vary, most experts believe at least 650,000 people were executed during the Great Purge, and more than 1 million were sent to Siberian labor camps known as gulags. Many wouldn't survive their imprisonment. Stalin also purged the senior ranks of the Red Army. Between 1936 and 1941, more than 30,000 senior officers were killed, imprisoned, or dismissed. Even the men at the very top of the Soviet military were targeted. Of the 5 original marshals of the Soviet Union, only 2 survived the Great Purge. At the same time, with the threat of war looming, Stalin ordered a massive expansion of the Red Army. As the number of new soldiers grew, the lack of experienced leadership became a huge issue, and officers were rushed into commission. In 1941, only half had completed any formal military education program. In the days leading up to Operation Barbarossa, Stalin received a significant amount of credible intelligence that a German invasion was imminent, and German troops were gathering on the Soviet border. He chose to ignore all of it. With the 1939 non-aggression pact in hand, Stalin simply didn't believe that Hitler would open an eastern front while still heavily engaged with the British on the western front. Respected Soviet spy Richard Zorge, who was working as a press officer in the German embassy in Japan, sent several reports detailing German plans to invade the USSR. On the 15th of May, he correctly predicted an attack between the 20th and 22nd of June. Winston Churchill, who was no fan of Joseph Stalin, sent the Soviet leader a message in April 1941 detailing what the British had uncovered with the help of the cracked Enigma machine about German deployments against the Soviet Union. Even Stalin's own border guards reported activity suggesting a coming invasion. Historian Alexander Dalin estimates at least 84 reports warning of the German invasion reached Stalin through diplomatic leaks, coded dispatches, and electronic intercepts. But Stalin's paranoia and mistrust of even his own intelligence officers resulted in these warnings going unheard. In the early morning hours of June 22, 1941, the Germans struck. They had mustered over 3 million men, 3,350 tanks, and nearly 3,000 aircraft, organized into three vast armies: Army Group North, Army Group South, and Army Group Center. Their targets were Leningrad, Kiev, and Moscow, respectively. At 3:15 a.m., German artillery began to fall on Soviet border positions. Shortly thereafter, German bombers struck Soviet airfields, destroying up to 40% of Soviet frontline air strength in just a few hours. Soviet planes were lined up neatly on their airfields, making them easy targets. German tanks and troops pushed deep into Soviet territory. The largely amateur Red Army found themselves facing experienced German forces honed in war since 1936, using their superior experience, mobility, and communications to cut them off. Stalin's first reaction was disbelief. The image Stalin had cultivated was that he was never wrong. He never admitted wrongdoing and hardly ever changed his mind. Here, he had completely failed to see what Germany were planning. The Soviet Union suffered an average of 46,000 casualties a day during the first 6 weeks of the war, and hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops were captured, but cracks were beginning to show. Where Stalin blundered by ignoring countless warnings of a coming invasion and by enacting a purge that undermined the Red Army, Hitler made an even more costly mistake. He believed the blitzkrieg that marked the beginning of the invasion would overwhelm the Soviets and the campaign would be over quickly. The three German army groups advanced so quickly and covered such vast distances that they became difficult to resupply. And as logistical issues bogged the Germans down, weeks turned into months, and the Soviet forces began to organize. And as the supply situation was worsening, so was the weather. The German forces had reached the outskirts of Moscow, but found themselves fighting both the enemy and the impending Russian winter, and they were ill-equipped to do either. Here Hitler made another mistake. In August 1941, against advice from the army's high command, he decided to halt the advance on Moscow and to reinforce Army Groups North and South. The German high command protested vigorously. The panzers were only 220 miles from Moscow. By the end of September, in the south, Kiev had fallen, and in the north, Leningrad had been surrounded, but supply lines were now stretched to their limit and the Germans couldn't take the city. Hitler decided to simply wait and starve the USSR's second largest city into submission. The siege would last 872 days. In October of 1941, Hitler decided to resume the battle for Moscow. He believed the Russians had been fatally weakened and lacked the strength to defend their capital. One more push would see it fall and victory would be his. But he was wrong. The Red Army had been reinforced thanks to Soviet spy Richard Zorge. The Soviets hadn't committed all of their forces to counter the Germans. In fact, there was a significant force gathered in Siberia, guarding against another enemy lurking just off Russia's eastern coastline, the Japanese. At this point, Richard Zorge had been working in Japan for 8 years, and his spy ring was embedded deep within the Japanese government. He uncovered a piece of intelligence that proved vital in turning the tide of Operation Barbarossa. His intelligence network discovered that Japan's military leadership had no intention of mounting an attack on Russia. In fact, they had their eyes on another target entirely, America. That attack would happen on December 7th, 1941, at Pearl Harbor. When Zorge's information was relayed to Joseph Stalin, this time he listened. When the Battle of Moscow began in early October of 1941, the German forces saw some early success, but the autumn weather turned the ground into a muddy quagmire, slowing their progress, and by November, the snow had arrived. The German troops were freezing with no winter clothing, using equipment that was not designed for such low temperatures. The Soviet troops defending the capital were then bolstered by the arrival of the Siberian troops. These were not the untrained and badly organized soldiers that had been thrown into the fray in the early weeks of the invasion. These troops were well-trained and battle-hardened. On December 5th, the Soviets launched a surprise counter-offensive. Despite Hitler's call to defend every foot of ground, the Germans were defeated and forced into a retreat. A furious Hitler fired the commander-in-chief of the German army and appointed himself in his place. The Battle of Moscow was Hitler's first defeat on land in the Second World War and marked the end of Operation Barbarossa. Hitler would regroup and launch an offensive on Stalingrad. It too was a disaster for the Germans and a turning point in World War II. The Soviet-German front that opened with Operation Barbarossa proved to be the decisive theatre of the Second World War. 82% of German military casualties occurred on the Eastern Front. Over the next 4 years, nearly 10% of Germany's pre-war population and a staggering 16% of the USSRs would die, mostly in the titanic struggle between Hitler and Stalin. While it's important to acknowledge Stalin's role in the war and the nature of the Soviet regime at the time, it's also vital to recognize the price paid by Soviet men and women in derailing Barbarossa and eventually defeating Germany. It's worth remembering that Soviet soldiers, more than any other, were responsible for Hitler's final defeat. When you compare Operation Barbarossa and the current Ukrainian offensive inside Russia's borders, the similarities stem from the fact that in both cases, the country's leadership was caught off guard. Stalin and Putin are both authoritarian leaders suffering from the dictator's dilemma. Both established a cult of personality around their leadership, and both used repression and violence to maintain their positions. In an atmosphere where free speech is suppressed, where fear of reprisal is very real, and where leaders are surrounded by cronies and sycophants, a dictator will never know the true state of affairs in his country and is perpetually presented with distorted information. After World War II, Stalin would continue to rule the Soviet Union until his death in 1953. As for Vladimir Putin, only time will tell. Thanks for watching.